Hello, Grace, and welcome back to our series on Cover to Cover. Over the next couple of days, we'll be finishing up the book of Leviticus and launching into the book of Numbers. Today, it's Leviticus chapters 25 and chapter 26. Before we begin, let's a quick overview. The book of Leviticus is divided into two parts. The first half is all kinds of procedural stuff of what is necessary and what it takes to worship and serve at the tabernacle. And then right there in the middle of the book is the Yom Kippur, the sacrificial lamb, that whole ceremony, the Day of Atonement. And then following the Day of Atonement procedure is something called the Holiness Code. And at that point, it moves away from this procedural stuff in the first half, more towards the moral code and the expectations of the people in the second half. So that's what's going on right there as we look at the book of Leviticus. The key element to remember in all of this is that Leviticus follows right after Exodus 40, where Yahweh is enthroned as the king of Israel in the tabernacle. And so the book of Exodus is kind of outlining all the procedures and the necessary aspects of what it means to have God in your midst. And that's a key thing to remember as we look for all these crazy laws and say, why are they there? What's going on here? Is two things are happening simultaneously. Number one, God is king over Israel, and there is a protocol when you walk in to meet the king. If you recall the book of Esther, and as we come up on the Feast of Purim in just a few days, the book of Esther will be read in its entirety in Jewish synagogues all over the world. But if you recall, at one point Esther wants to go and meet the king, who is her husband. And she says, if I go to the king and he does not extend his scepter, then my life is forfeit. I will die. There is a protocol for approaching the king. You can't just go whenever you want. You have to be called. And so keep this in mind as we look at these tabernacle laws and these things that are taking place in Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, is that we have an established protocol. The second thing to keep in mind is that we're talking about the presence of God here in the tabernacle among the people. Throughout the Old Testament, when people confront God, or even just the angels, come to them, you'll see something similar to what happens in Isaiah 6, where he says, woe is me, I am undone. To even look at God is to face death. We see this in tradition in lots of other religions. There's a famous Greek story of Semele and Zeus, where Zeus reveals his full glory to this woman, Semele, and she is immediately disintegrated. She just turns to ash. So the confrontation with God, with God's holiness, is dangerous. And so when we look at the commands, something that says, be ye holy, for I am holy, is keep in mind that this tabernacle is like a miniature Garden of Eden. It's penetrating the veil, and it's bringing the celestial world, this divine presence, into normal everyday life. And that is not something that we can lightly just approach. God's presence is dangerous. And everything that's going on here, these commands to be clean, these commands to be holy, is in preparation to keep us basically safe from the awesome terror and holiness of what it means to have the creator of the universe physically in your midst. So that's our setup here. As we proceed to chapters 25 and chapters 26 in Leviticus, you'll see this really great verse that Pastor Seth read yesterday. It says, the land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. With me you are but aliens and tenants. And so when we look at chapter 25, what we are introduced to is the idea of the Sabbath rest for the land, this Jubilee period that takes place every 50 years, and also the notion of the kinsman redeemer. What does all this have to do? Well, this is another aspect where we find a lot of cultural parallels, especially in Mesopotamia, where periodically the pagan kings would declare a jubilee. They would declare an absolution of debts for people. Why would they do this? Because life was hard, and simply put, a subsistence farmer could be one bad harvest away from falling into debt. And if there was famine in the land, somebody could be forced into slavery, into debt slavery, indentured servitude, selling all that they had. And so it was an economic policy. The king would declare righteousness and justice throughout the land when they did this, when they proclaimed the absolution of debts. And it was seen as like something that was economically necessary in order to maintain the economy. We might call this distributive justice now, or restorative justice, or even just economic justice. But the idea is that justice and righteousness in the Old Testament and in this culture were not simply moral categories of what you did or didn't do. They extended into every aspect of life. So let's look at them just a little bit more closely, starting with the kinsman redeemer. This is something that we're going to see in Ruth. What takes place there? This was a provision so that if somebody did fall into dire straits, a family member could come in and could rescue them from that. You would have a kinsman redeemer that can kind of pull you up from the bottom and help you out, help you restore your wealth, your passion, restore your property, and also maintain the family name so you didn't fall into perpetual and generational slavery. The second thing that would happen is you'd have these, every 7 years the land would rest. And keep in mind, this isn't just crop rotation. This is, certainly it includes that, but there would also be a release of debts, and debt slaves would be released at this time. Again, this is an economic policy, and it would be rooted in the fact that Israel itself used to be slaves in Egypt, and Yahweh is like, I already redeemed you out of Egypt. You don't need to be slaves anymore. And then finally, every 50 years, land inheritance would return to the original family. And so the Jubilee system, the kinsman redeemer system, the idea of the Sabbath rest and the releasing of debts, all of this is related to the idea that we, no matter who we are and when we are strangers and sojourners on this earth. Our home is a heavenly home, and we ought not to be too attached to the stuff of this world. And this leads us next to Leviticus chapter 26. Chapter 26 is interesting. This is a long litany of blessings and curses. Why is this here and what's going on? This is another example of where studying something in the ancient Near East really kind of helps you out. In the middle of the 20th century, we found a lot of treaty covenants, especially some from the Hittite kingdoms, which are located up in Turkey. And what they found out is when they looked through all these different treaties, each treaty covenant, these treaty formats, they had basically contracts, between kings and their subjects, that they had a very recognizable format. And then a couple of scholars looked at the Bible and noticed that aspects of the Bible followed those same formats. And so what we have here is a literary genre of what's taking place, is that the book of Leviticus, and especially the second half, the Holiness Code, is being literarily framed in a covenant treaty format. And one of those most significant aspects of covenant treaties is they usually conclude with blessings and curses. Blessings for obedience. These are all the things that you're going to get if you stay loyal to the king. And curses for those who do not. This is significant because it's saying many things all at once. First, that the state of Israel, the nation of Israel, is a covenant people, that they have entered into a contract with Yahweh. And there are specific provisions. There's things that they are required to do. So it's not, an optional thing. This is what's going on. Second, it's reaffirming the notion that God is their king. And so that's a key element when you see this covenant treaty format, is it really kind of brings you into mind, the idea of a suzerain or a king and the subjects and his people. So it's a reaffirmation of the special relationship that Yahweh has with his people. That even if there is a judge, even if there is a prophet, even if there is a worldly king, it is Yahweh who is the king of the people, who sits enthroned between the cherubim, who resides in the midst of the community. if you look a little bit closer throughout the Torah, you'll see another set of curses and blessings, and this happens in Deuteronomy. The curses and blessings in Leviticus are slightly different from the ones in Deuteronomy. And one of the significant differences is here in Leviticus, it concludes with a restoration clause. It anticipates what's about to happen in the book of Numbers. If you follow the narration, the flow of the plot in the book of Numbers, you're going to see that the plot of Numbers is going to follow this chapter, chapter 26. It's going to start with blessing. It's going to go into disobedience of the people, and then there's going to be this restoration by the time we get to the end of Numbers. And so this is the setup for what's about to come. Another aspect that's really significant is that in this setup, the Leviticus blessings and curses conclude with a reminder that God's covenant is always faithful, that God's covenant is rooted in a promise to Jacob, to the patriarchs. And so God's faithfulness is not contingent upon the obedience of the people of Israel. That's significant. That's very different. God is essentially anticipating that the people, try as they might, are going to fail. They may succeed, they may not succeed, whatever's happening. But He is going to be faithful. He has chosen this people. And no matter what happens, He has chosen to restore them. And that is a comforting thought to take away from Leviticus chapter 26.